Now, let's get to tax reform and what tax reform actually means, because we know the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals are that the intergenerational report, which was, by the way, released the same day that Donald Trump was taking a mugshot, okay? So let's not pretend Trump turns up and everything turned to poop, right? The structural spending of the federal government is now so massive that there is expected to be zero, obviously there might be every now and then, but zero budget surpluses between now and the 2060s. The population will apparently head up to 40 million people, but the amount that government spends will continue to go uppity up, meaning that the Ponzi scheme starts to fail, meaning it's time to start looking for new forms of money. In fact, here is the Treasurer saying as much.
Now, no sensible progress can be made on productivity, resilience or budget sustainability without proper consideration of more tax reform. I don't just accept that, I welcome that.
Everything's on the table. We've got 94 seats. The opposition basically doesn't exist. We're going to rule forever. Seems like the perfect time, Bronwyn, to actually start to say what they should have, of course, been forced to admit before the election. But among other things, this is everything from increasing the GST, negative gearing on housing. If everything's on the table, then everything's on the table.
Well, you've heard me call him the snake charmer because he's the illusionist. That whole campaign was based on a lie.
Agreed.
He said the budget is in great shape. And then he goes to the press club and says it is unsustainable. Now, that is the truth, but we weren't told that.
Yep.
And when he says more tax reform, leave off the word reform, it just means more tax. Reform is the most overused word in the English language currently. It is meant to mean there's a good outcome, but the way it's used, it's just plain change. So what we're seeing is we've compressed the private sector, which is useful and does have productivity growth, to the section of the economy which is now dependent on government spending.
Correct.
And the idea that he wants productivity now, when the whole first term was designed against productivity, whether it was the IR changes, whether it was boosting more money into that sector at the expense of the private sector, taking people who were in the employment, wanting a job, going into that, shall we say, less productive sector than where wealth is generated. So it's a mess. And the idea that he's going to change the GST, I just laugh at that. I mean, I've heard it so often. He knows damn well that bracket creep will give him more money than changing the GST, and it will have less angst.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that because of where they sit at their political zenith right now, their assumption is that if the last major moment of tax reform was the 1998 election in and around GST, and there was one hell of a backbench to burn.
Can I say about that?
Yeah, please.
The truth of it was that I was on the road selling the GST under John Hewson. It was part of Fight Back. The work had already been done. When we came to 1998, quite frankly, John Howard didn't have anything else to go to the election on. The work had already been done, so it was a matter of upgrading, and I was back on the road doing, I can't tell you how many functions I do. And it was, the real purpose was to abolish the wholesale sales tax, which Paul Keating had just increased dramatically. And that, in fact, was why the reason that we went with it.
And one of the ways that conversation takes place is that when they're able to turn around and say, look, here's half a dozen taxes that currently exist. We're going to blast them all out and wrap it into something else. I know we're fighting with the history books here, but I'm just saying, just let me get Joe in here, which is what is the positive example of tax reform here? Because I know that could mean, well, tax reform also means company tax comes down and individual tax comes down. Yeah, but if the budget is currently unsustainable, more revenue has to come from somewhere.
Yep, that's right. So one of the things that should cheer you all up is tax on electric vehicles. That's one of the things that's been flagged because, of course, as fuel reliance goes down, you lose the petrol tax. Sorry, Bronwyn, please continue.
No, come on.
That's pissant stuff.
It is. We're going to... Wow, well done.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, but also, we are $1 trillion in debt. So this is what I'm saying. So not just balancing but turn around. So again, let's give you some free rein.
So the best thing you can do, I mean, the thing that the government has done more than anything, as soon as it got this massive mandate, as soon as it got this massive number of seats or whatever, everyone's like, oh, it's going to implement a scary new socialist agenda. Oh, they've been hiding this green left agenda. The first thing they started talking about was productivity. Now you can say, well, why didn't you do that in your first term, whatever? But that is the government's true agenda.
The second thing was tax reform.
And that is what, but again, one leads to the other, gives you more room for another. So if you have each worker being more, and organisations and companies being more productive, they're going to produce more tax, and that solves your budget problem. So if you solve the productivity problem, to some extent, you solve the tax problem. There is, of course, a question about either broadening the base of the GST or increasing the rate. Now, again, that solves a lot of problems because you pick up a whole bunch of stuff that means that, you know, clever accountants can't get out of. And
I reckon some of the everything on the table is going to be, we're going to peg negative gearing at 2 properties. Starting from this date, everyone who's currently on the arrangement, you'll be fine. Right? I think there'll be some of that stuff so they can start to fiddle with forever numbers, because the political reality is that if everyone wants the spending but nobody wants to pay for it, then one of those 2 things is going to break, and break sooner rather than later.
Well, the reason he said that more tax reform is because of the need for more money to be spent on defence and more money to be spent to support the care economy, of which the NDIS, of course, is the largest component. The reality is that if you stopped trying to rewire the nation and gave up on the ridiculous concept of transmission lines, $1 trillion, that could pay for our defence requirements, and it could pay for a lot of the care economy. But you can't have both. You can't have this expensive system of energy, which is cruelling productivity, and increase expenditure on defending our own nation.
I agree. But a problem, or the problem, of course, Joe, is we just had an election where it was pretty obvious what the government's position was. It was pretty obvious what their double down was.
That's right. And it's pretty obvious what people,
their numbers.
That's right. And then people
I don't like it.
I know. And again, I've got no problem with nuclear. The Australian electorate does. Okay. And yes, there are going to be upfront capital expenses associated with building all this infrastructure. And yes, you're going to kiss goodbye to all those, you know, those resources from. But
I admire that you're the first person in 15 years who sat here and actually said that.
Yeah, that's right.
So guess what? It's going to cost a lot to build it, and that flows through somehow, somewhere. And you're the first one to actually admit it.
And then the hope is that eventually, because you've spent all that money, once it is there, once you've got the battery storage, once the technology is there, and maybe we'll have small nuclear reactors one day that solve all our problems. Maybe green hydrogen will. But this is the way the rest of the world is going. Yes, some are doing it with nuclear, but either way, we're not going to be able to rely on coal forever, simply because there will no longer be a market for it elsewhere. So we have to start looking at other things.
That market's going to be there for a long, long, long time to come. And the reality is that it produces the cheapest power, which is why India uses it, why China uses it.
Yep, I know, but they will be cutting down. And China and India, I mean, everyone rolls out the China example. Yes, China's building a lot of coal-fired power stations.
Correct.
It is also building a huge amount of wind farms and solar farms. It is building more of both than any other economy, and that's because it's bigger than any other economy. And yes, it gets a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card for its coal use because it's got an extra 10 years on the rest of us.
Coal is producing most of its required power.
But also,
yes,
and it can do it, and it can do it cheaply.
But also, is Australia sitting in a position where, because of our comfort, right? Reality is, when you look at the climate clock of every country and how much they produce, I've said this a million times before, right? China takes you to quarter past, all right?
Yep.
Net zero doesn't affect them, all right? Instead, 33% of global emissions. The third world, or developing or global south, takes you to about half past, all right? Then we go India, then we go Russia, then we go the United States. That's 45 minutes of the climate clock that basically ain't playing with Paris.
Yeah, and I swear to God, if everyone spent all their energy saying, no, China should not get a carve-out for an extra 10 years that the rest of us don't. It is ridiculous that a country that is clearly a superpower, that has its own space program, that is effectively an empire state, that they should not have that extra 10 years.
Absolutely.
Instead of arguing about all the other stuff about, you know.
And what do you reckon their reaction be? Say,
Yeah,
Yeah,
facile
well-
state.
Well, that is the real
But
question.
you know what I love
That's
most,
the
Joe, is that he's heard every one of those lines I've said for how many years, and now, there's free 95 seats. Now he can turn around and say, you know what, you're right, Paul. China's not a developing country. It's got a space station. Yeah, you're right, Paul. The cost of transmission, absolutely correct.